1505, a hundredweight of pepper sold in Lisbon for about 30 ducats. The same weight of the same pepper in Alexandria sold for 192. The country selling it at 30 had never grown a grain of it. It had no pepper vines, no cinnamon, no cloves, no nutmeg, no silver, no great river, no cropland worth the name. It sat at the far western corner of Europe, with its back to the mountains and its face to an empty ocean, and it held a population of barely 1 million people. Within 20 years, that country's ships were taxing the sea traffic between Mozambique and Nagasaki. Its officials sold licenses that Gujarati, Arab, Malay and Chinese merchants had to buy, in order to sail waters their families had worked for 800 years. Its king took a fixed percentage of everything that moved. 2 centuries later, the same country took delivery of the largest quantity of gold that had ever crossed an ocean. Roughly 800 tons, dug out of the hills of Brazil, landed on the quays of Lisbon across a single century. And by the end of that century, it was poorer than the countries it had been supplying. It still is. Today, Portugal has one of the lowest incomes per person in Western Europe. Its young people leave for Switzerland and Germany and have been leaving for 60 years. Both things are true at once. This is the country that built the first empire to touch every ocean on Earth, and almost none of the money stayed. So where did it go? The distance between 30 ducats and 192 is the whole story. Pepper grew in one narrow place, the Malabar coast of southern India, a strip of wet green hill country facing the Arabian Sea. Cinnamon grew in Ceylon. Cloves and nutmeg grew nowhere on Earth except a scatter of small volcanic islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago, a fact that gave those islands a value out of all proportion to their size. For centuries, all of it moved the same way. Down to the Malabar ports, across the Arabian Sea in Gujarati and Arab hulls, up the Red Sea or up the Gulf, overland by camel to Cairo or Aleppo, into Venetian galleys at Alexandria, then west, across the Mediterranean, into Europe. 8 or 9 changes of hand. Every hand took a margin, every border took a duty. The Mamluk sultans in Egypt taxed it. The Venetians priced what was left. By the time a peppercorn reached a kitchen in Antwerp, its price had almost nothing to do with what a farmer in Kerala had been paid for it. What the Portuguese found was not a spice. It was a shortcut. One hull, one owner. Out of the Tagus, down the length of Africa, around a cape at the bottom of the world, across the Indian Ocean, load and return. No camels, no sultans, no Venetians. And this is the part that gets remembered wrongly. Portugal is filed in most people's minds under discovery. The caravels, the charts, the navigators with their names on squares and statues. But discovery was the expense, not the income. The voyages were brutally costly and frequently fatal. Ships were lost at a rate that would end any modern business. The fortune came from something far less romantic than a map. It came from the ability to charge, to stand between a producer and a buyer and set the number, to own the gap. And a gap is not a mine. A gap can close. It took Portugal about a century to learn that, and another 200 years to finish paying for the lesson. It began, as these things usually do, with somebody looking for gold. For most of the Middle Ages, Europe knew that gold came from Africa. It arrived in Morocco and Tunis by camel caravan out of the Sahara, from somewhere in the Sahel, from mines that European merchants had never seen and could not reach. The trade was controlled end to end by people who had no reason to explain how it worked. The Portuguese decided to go around the desert, not across it, around it, by sea. In 1415 they took Ceuta, on the Moroccan side of the Strait of Gibraltar, expecting to capture the caravan trade at its terminus. They captured the city. The caravans simply went elsewhere. It was the first lesson, and it was an expensive one. Holding a port does not deliver the trade behind it. So they went further, down the Atlantic
Coast of Africa, past Cape Bojador, which took them 14 years of failed attempts to round because the currents there run one way and the winds run with them, and a ship that sailed south could not simply sail back north the way it had come. Solving that problem produced the caravel, a small, lateen-rigged vessel that could work at an angle to the wind. It was not built to explore. It was built to come home. By the 1440s, they were trading at Arguim, an island off the coast of what is now Mauritania. By 1482, they had built a stone fortress at Elmina on the Gold Coast in modern Ghana. Elmina means the mine. It was not a mine. It was a counting house with walls. And what moved through it was not only gold. From the 1440s onward, Portuguese ships were carrying captured and purchased human beings north out of West Africa. At first in small numbers to Lisbon and the Algarve. The trade was not incidental to the enterprise. It ran alongside the gold from the beginning, in the same hulls, cleared by the same officials, taxed by the same crown. The pattern set at Elmina would be repeated for 400 years in every ocean Portugal reached. Fortify a point of exchange. Hold it lightly. Do not attempt the interior. Tax what passes. The interior was expensive. The point of exchange was cheap. But the trade that taught Portugal how to be rich was not gold, and it was not spice. It was sugar. And it happened on an island that had no people on it at all. Madeira sits 600 kilometers off the Moroccan coast. A volcanic ridge dropped into the Atlantic, so steep that the sea floor falls away within sight of the shore. When Portuguese ships found it in the 1420s, it was uninhabited and covered, from the waterline to the cloud, in dense laurel forest. The name they gave it means wood. They cleared it and they planted wheat, and the wheat did well enough for a while. Then somebody made a calculation. Sugarcane had been grown in Sicily and Cyprus for centuries. It was not a food in Europe. It was a luxury and a medicine, sold by the ounce in apothecaries, priced against spice rather than against grain. Madeira had the climate for it, and volcanic soil, and steady water coming down off the peaks. Cane was brought in from Sicily. Genoese and Florentine bankers put up the capital because Portugal did not have any. And within 2 generations, a rock in the ocean became the largest sugar producer in the world. The numbers move quickly. By 1485, the island was producing around 800 tons of sugar a year. By 1500, 1200. By 1510, 1900. At the peak, there were around 150 mills operating out of Funchal alone, and a fleet of up to 70 merchant ships running the cargo north to Antwerp, where the refineries were, and where the profit was actually taken. And here is the mechanism that mattered more than any of it. Sugar is not harvested. It is manufactured. Cane must be cut, crushed, and the juice boiled down, and boiling takes fire. To produce 1 kilogram of sugar on Madeira required roughly 50 kilograms of wood. The island was named for its forest.
The forest was the fuel. By 1485, there were around 2,500 enslaved people on the island. By 1510, around 3,500, brought from the West African coast through the same fortified stations that had been built to buy gold, because the plantations needed labor on a scale the Portuguese settlers could not supply and would not perform. They cut the cane, they cut the wood, they carried it down slopes so steep that the paths had to be built like staircases, to mills that burned through the timber faster than a forest can grow. Within 50 years, roughly 3/4 of Madeira's forest was gone, and when the wood went, the sugar went with it. The mills had to reach further and higher for fuel, and the cost of every kilogram climbed. Production collapsed to around 1,000 tons by 1520 and to 550 by 1530. The richest island in the Atlantic had burned its own engine. But the model survived. That was the thing that was actually being built on Madeira, and it outlived the sugar by 400 years. Enclosed land, bought labor, a single export crop. Capital from elsewhere. Refining and profit-taking somewhere else again. It moved to the Azores, then to Cape Verde, then to São Tomé, and then across the Atlantic to Brazil, and then to the Caribbean. And it did not stop. Remember the wood. It comes back. Meanwhile, the ships kept going south. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa and found that the coast turned northeast. The route existed. It took another 9 years for anyone to use it because the Portuguese crown, having spent decades and a great deal of money finding the door, took its time deciding what to do with it. In July 1497, 4 ships left the beach at Restelo, below Lisbon. The voyage took 309 days. On the 20th of May 1498, they anchored off Calicut on the Malabar coast. And the arrival was, by any measure, a failure. Calicut was not a village. It was one of the great ports of the Indian Ocean, a city that had been handling the pepper of the Malabar Hills for centuries under a Hindu ruler called the Zamarin, with a resident community of Arab merchants who had financed the trade for generations and had no interest whatsoever in a new competitor. The gifts the Portuguese brought ashore were striped cloth, sugar, honey, coral beads, hats, and a case of wash basins. The Zamarin's officials looked at them and asked whether this was a joke. The poorest merchant from Mecca gave more. 2 facts sat side by side in that harbour, and neither one was exaggerated. The Portuguese had crossed a distance no European ship had crossed before, and had arrived with nothing anyone wanted. And within 15 years, they would be setting the price of the cargo in that harbour. The reason has almost nothing to do with the goods, and everything to do with the ships. Indian Ocean trade had been open for 8 centuries, not undefended, but not fought over either. The monsoon set the schedule, and the schedule was shared. Merchant hulls were built for capacity, sewn rather than nailed in many yards, and carried little in the way of artillery, because nobody had made a business out of sinking them. Portuguese ships had come around Africa through the Atlantic swell. They were built heavy, they were nailed, and they carried cannon on deck as a matter of course, because a ship crossing that much open water has to be able to look after itself. What arrived in the Indian Ocean in 1498 was not a superior merchant. It was a warship, in a market that had never needed one. The second voyage came back with 13 ships and instructions to negotiate from strength. When the negotiation failed, they bombarded the city. This is the part that tends to fall out of the sentence about a sea route to India. The route was not opened by charts. It was opened by artillery, and by a decision that the trade of an entire ocean could be taken by force from the people who had built it. And the cargo the ships carried home did exactly what the ledgers had promised. Pepper is a climbing vine. It fruits as small green berries in dense strings, and when the berries are picked and dried in the sun, they blacken and wrinkle and become almost weightless. It keeps for years. It does not spoil at sea. A ship can carry a fortune in it and barely notice the load. Europe had wanted it for 1,000 years and had never been able to buy it directly. In Malabar, the growers were paid in coin and cloth. In Lisbon, the same weight sold for many times that. In Alexandria, 30 ducats against 192. And pepper was the cheap one. Cloves are the dried flower buds of a tree that, until the 19th century, grew wild on 5 small islands in the northern Moluccas: Ternate, Tidor, and 3 neighbours, none of them more than a few kilometres across. Nutmeg and mace, which are 2 different parts of the same fruit, grew on the Banda Islands, a volcanic cluster further south, smaller still. That is the entire world's supply. A handful of islands you could sail past in a morning, supplying every kitchen and apothecary from Cairo to Cologne. The multiple on that trade was not the 4 or 5 of pepper. Cloves bought in the Moluccas and sold in Europe could return many times their purchase price, and the whole business could be carried in a corner of a hold. The Portuguese reached the Banda Islands in 1512 and built a fort on Ternate soon after. They never controlled the growing. The islands were too many, the sultans too independent, and the local traders too good at going around them. What they controlled was the strait everything had to pass through on the way out. Venetian merchants who had run the European end of the spice trade for 300 years began buying their pepper in Lisbon. That single fact is the transfer of an economy from one city to another, and it took less than a decade. Venice did not collapse, but it stopped setting the price, and a middleman who cannot set the price is only a customer. Which raises a question the Portuguese would spend the next century answering badly. If the whole fortune is a gap between 2 prices, what stops somebody else from standing in it? The place where all of this became money was a building on the waterfront in Lisbon, the Casa da India, the House of India. From 1497, it financed and organised the annual armadas, the fleets that left the Tagus each spring for Goa and came back, if they came back, more than a year later. It licensed the voyages, it warehoused the cargo, it cleared the customs, it ran the crown monopoly on pepper, cinnamon and cloves, which meant that the King of Portugal was not merely taxing the spice trade, he was the spice trade. There is no clean modern equivalent, because no modern state both owns the cargo and writes the customs law and holds the navy that enforces it. Lisbon did all 3 from one address on one key. In the 16th century, more than half of the Portuguese crown's revenue came from West African gold and from Indian pepper and other spices. And the spices greatly outweighed the gold. Now watch what a state does with money like that. It is the summer of 1501. On the beach at Rastello, on the north bank of the Tagus, where the fleets take on water before they turn out into the Atlantic, workmen begin cutting foundations for a monastery. King Manuel I has made a vow. The building will be enormous. 100 years in the making, worked by architects from France, from Spain, from Portugal, one after another as the decades pass. Its stone will be carved with rope, coral, seaweed, anchors, armillary spheres. Not saints, rigging. To pay for it, the king assigns a dedicated tax, roughly 5% of the revenue from trade with Africa and the East. Contemporaries valued it at about 70 kilograms of gold a year, running continuously into one construction site. The duties on pepper, cinnamon and cloves themselves are excluded. Those go straight to the crown. The tax had a name, the Vintena da Pimenta, the pepper 20th. The monastery is still standing in Belém at the western edge of Lisbon. It is the most photographed building in the country, and the people who live around it have a nickname for it that does the whole economic analysis in 3 words. They call it the one that Pepper built. Hold on to that. We come back to it. Because there is a question underneath all that carved stone, and it is not an unkind one. A country receives an enormous, sudden external income. What does it build with it? Portugal built monasteries, palaces, a royal chapel, naval yards, fortresses on 3 continents, and a court of extraordinary luxury. What it did not build, what it never really built, was an industry. It did not spin cloth in any quantity. It did not make its own fine textiles, or its own glass, or much of its own metalwork. It bought them. And the money that bought them left. Because Lisbon was not where the spice trade ended. Lisbon was where the spice trade docked. The cargo came off the ships, cleared the Casa da India, paid its duty, and then a very large share of it went straight back onto other hulls, heading north. From 1508, the transshipment of Lisbon spices made Antwerp the leading trading centre in Europe. Antwerp had the refineries. Antwerp had the distribution into the German lands and the Baltic and England. And Antwerp had the banks, the Italian and South German houses that had financed the voyages in the first place and that took their return
before anybody else took theirs. One of them is worth naming because he stands at both ends of this story. Bartolomeo Marchionni, a Florentine merchant and banker resident in Lisbon, financed Portuguese voyages, held concessions in the African trade, dealt in enslaved people, and gave money toward the works at Belém. The capital running the first global empire was foreign from the first day. And capital goes home. This is the thing the marble at Belém makes almost impossible to see. Portugal did not hold the wealth of the East, it handled it. The cargo was Portuguese for the length of one river bend, and then it belonged to someone else again. And the margin taken in Antwerp was, quietly, wider than the margin taken in Lisbon. A corridor is not a destination. But when you are standing in the middle of one, and the ships keep coming, it is very difficult to tell the difference. There is one part of the Portuguese economy that never depended on any of this. It is still working. Off the Algarve and up the western coast,
The cold Canary Current runs south along the shore, and the summer winds push the surface water offshore. Deep water rises to replace it, carrying nutrients up out of the dark. Plankton bloom in the sunlight, and into the bloom come the sardines, small, silver, moving in schools that can run for kilometers and turn as one body. They live around 6 years. They spawn offshore in the cold months and press in toward the coast in summer, following the food. Which is why the fishing towns sit where they sit, and have sat there since before there was a Portugal. The sardine required no fleet to reach, no fortress to hold, no license, no monsoon, no banker in Florence. It arrived by itself every year at the door. Nobody built a monastery about it. By 1505, the Crown understood that a trade route is only worth what you can defend, and that the Indian Ocean was too large to patrol. So one man proposed not patrolling it. Afonso de Albuquerque looked at a map of the Indian Ocean and saw something that nobody had needed to see before, because nobody had ever tried to own the whole thing. He saw that all of that water drained through a very small number of doors. Everything moving between Asia and the Mediterranean by way of the Persian Gulf passed the island of Hormuz in a strait a few dozen kilometers wide. Everything moving by way of the Red Sea passed Aden. Everything moving between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea passed through the Strait of Malacca, in places barely 2 kilometers across. 3 doors. Hold 3 doors, and you do not need to hold the ocean. In November 1510, Albuquerque took Goa, a port city on the Arabian Sea, and made it the capital of the Estado da India, the state of India, with shipyards, a hospital, and a mint. In 1511, he took Malacca with around 1,200 men against a far larger force. In 1515, he took Hormuz and built a fortress on it. None of it would have been possible without a single afternoon off the Gujarati coast the year before. It is February 1509, off the port of Diu. A combined fleet, Mamluk Egyptian, Gujarati and Calicut ships backed by Venetian money and Ottoman gunners, because everybody who lost money when Lisbon set the price had an interest in this, meets a smaller Portuguese squadron under Francisco de Almeida. The Portuguese ships were fewer and heavier, and they fought at a distance, with guns, rather than closing to board. By evening, the Allied fleet was destroyed. One battle settled who would tax the Arabian Sea for the next 100 years. Everything Albuquerque built afterwards rested on the fact that after Diu, nobody in the region had a fleet capable of contesting him. Aden he never got. Its defences and its Mamluk and later Ottoman garrisons held. And that one open door would matter more than the 2 that closed. But with Goa, Malacca and Hormuz in hand, Portugal did something no European power had done before, and something the Dutch and the English would copy exactly. It invented the paperwork. Any non-Portuguese ship sailing those waters was required to carry a cartaz, a license. The cartaz named the ship, named the master, specified the route, specified what the cargo could and could not include, and required the vessel to call at a Portuguese port and pay duty on the way through. A ship without one was liable to be stopped, seized, or sunk. It should be said plainly what that means. Merchant families who had been sailing between Gujarat and Aden for 300 years now had to buy permission from a European garrison to make a voyage their grandfathers had made freely. Ships that refused were burned with their crews aboard. The system was not a customs regime. It was a protection arrangement enforced by artillery, and it was described as such at the time. And it worked, financially, better than anything else Portugal ever built. Duties ran to around a tenth of a cargo's value. The garrisons were small, the forts were stone and cheap to hold. There were no inland campaigns to fund, no territories to administer, no populations to feed. By the 1520s, the revenues moving through that network were counted in the millions of cruzados a year. Consider what that actually is. Portugal produced nothing in Asia. It grew nothing, mined nothing, wove nothing. It bought spice with silver and copper it mostly did not have, and it made up the difference by charging other people to use the sea. The empire's real export was permission. And permission has a peculiar property, which the ledgers of the 16th century record with great clarity. It costs almost nothing to produce, and it collapses the moment it stops being credible. The cracks were there from the start, and they all led back to Aden. Because Aden stayed open, the Red Sea route stayed open. Arab and Ottoman merchants kept moving spice up to Egypt, and from Egypt to Venice, and the old route never actually died. By the second half of the 16th century, it was prospering again, because European demand was growing faster than Portuguese hulls could carry. And even inside its own system, Portugal leaked. Officials in Goa and Cochin traded on their own account and did not pay the crown its share. Corruption was not an aberration in the Estado da India, it was the operating condition. Royal profit from the pepper monopoly fell from something over 250,000 cruzados a year to under 90,000 by the end of the century. Between 5,000 and 10,000 Portuguese left for the East every year across 2 centuries. Around 2/3 came back. Many came back wealthy. The crown, increasingly, did not. The toll booth was collecting less and less of what passed through it. But the passing through was as loud as ever, and nobody in Lisbon mistook one for the other until it was far too late. Except in one place, at the far end of everything, where the arithmetic stayed extraordinary for another 70 years. In 1543, a Portuguese ship blown off course landed on a small island off southern Japan. What the crew found there was a country in the middle of a long civil war, with rich silver mines on Honshu, an appetite for fine goods, and an official ban on trading with China. China wanted silver. Japan had silver. Japan wanted silk. China had silk. And the two of them were forbidden by law to trade with each other. Into that gap sailed the Portuguese, who were forbidden by nobody. In 1557, the Chinese authorities at Canton leased them a peninsula called Macau in exchange for tribute. From 1571, the fishing village of Nagasaki became their fixed Japanese port. And once a year, riding the monsoon, a single enormous carrack made the run. The Japanese called it the Kurofune, the black ship, its hull painted with pitch against the sea worms. The Portuguese called it the Nau do Trato, the trade ship. It sailed from Goa by way of Malacca to Macau. It loaded Chinese raw silk, silk cloth, porcelain, and gold. It waited for the summer monsoon and ran east to Nagasaki, where the silk sold immediately and at whatever price was asked. It loaded Japanese silver. It came back to Macau on the autumn wind. The whole circuit could take 2 years because the monsoons only turned twice. The numbers on that voyage are the highest in the empire. A captain major who invested 20,000 cruzados could expect to bring home something in the order of 150,000. Total Portuguese exports
out of Nagasaki across the 16th century ran to more than 1 million cruzados. The ships themselves grew to 1,600 tons to carry it. Nagasaki grew with them, from a fishing village to 5,000 people by 1590, 15,000 by 1600, with a hospital, a Jesuit college, and a painting school. And it was the only leg of the entire empire that Portugal never lost in battle. It was closed by a letter. The trade came bundled with missionaries, and the missionaries made converts by the 100,000. And in 1637, a rebellion in the Shimabara Peninsula was blamed on Christian influence. In 1639, when the great ship arrived at Nagasaki, the captain was handed an imperial decree. The Macau trade was ended. No Portuguese was to set foot in Japan on pain of death. Macau sent a delegation the following year to argue the point. Most of them were executed on arrival. 96 years of the most profitable route in the world finished in a single document over something that had nothing to do with money at all. While all this was happening in the east, the model built on Madeira had crossed the Atlantic and it had grown. São Tomé sits almost exactly on the equator in the Gulf of Guinea, 300 kilometers off the African coast. Like Madeira, it was uninhabited. Unlike Madeira, it was tied directly to Elmina. It served as the entrepot for the African trade in gold and in enslaved people, which meant that the labor and the land sat in the same account book. Cane fields are documented there from 1506. By 1517, there were 2 mills running and plans for 10 more. The scale of the labor changed here, and the character of it changed with the scale. On Madeira, much of the enslaved population had worked in and around the town, in households and workshops, as well as in the fields. On São Tomé, the plantation was the island. There was no other economy. And from the 1530s, the whole apparatus was moved again, to a coastline that was effectively unlimited: Brazil. What had been an experiment on a rock in the Atlantic became the largest forced migration in recorded history. Over 3.5 centuries, Portuguese ships carried more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic than the ships of any other nation, the great majority of them to Brazil, to cut cane, and later to dig for gold. Every figure in this story after 1450 rests on that. The pepper 20th, the carved stone at Belém, the palaces, the mints, the fleets. It was not a cost of the fortune, it was the fortune. And then, at the turn of the 17th century, other people arrived in the Indian Ocean with better ships and more money. In 1580, the Portuguese king died without an heir, and the crown passed to Philip II of Spain. For 60 years, Portugal and its empire were governed as the junior hearth of a Spanish monarchy that was at war with the Dutch Republic, which meant that every Portuguese fort in the world became a legitimate target in somebody else's war. The Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602 with something Portugal had never possessed: pooled private capital, raised from thousands of investors, renewable, and answerable to a board rather than a king. It could absorb the loss of a fleet. It could sit out a bad year. It could plan across decades. Portugal's empire was a royal monopoly, financed by whoever the crown could borrow from that season. One of those two structures was built to survive a shock. The Dutch took Ambon in 1605. They founded Batavia in 1619 as a permanent base, and then they went for the doors. It is 1622. A joint English and Persian force takes Hormuz.
The fortress Albuquerque, built at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, falls, and with it, the customs revenue on Persian silk, on Indian spice, on the Arabian horses that had passed through that strait for centuries. It is August 1640. Dutch ships close on Malacca and begin a siege that lasts 5 months. Disease and starvation take both sides apart. In January 1641, the Dutch storm the citadel, and 130 years of Portuguese control of the strait ends. Colombo went in 1656, Cochin in 1663. The pepper ports of the Malabar coast, the cinnamon of Ceylon, the strait to the Spice Islands, gone inside a generation. And the doors that Albuquerque had counted so carefully were now being counted by somebody else. Portugal held Goa. It held Macau. It held Diu and Damao, and a handful of coastal points, and it would hold some of them for a very long time. Goa until 1961, Macau until 1999. But they had stopped being a system. They were addresses. Portugal regained its independence from Spain in 1640 and paid for the peace with territory. Ceuta went to Spain in 1668. In 1661, Bombay and Tangier were handed to England as part of a royal dowry. Bombay, given away as a wedding present by a kingdom that no longer had the ships to hold it. So the empire turned around. If the money was no longer coming from the east, it would have to come from the west. Brazil had been claimed in 1500, and for nearly 2 centuries treated as the poor relation. A coastline of sugar plantations that mattered far less to Lisbon than a single loaded carrack out of Goa. By the 1690s, the sugar was in trouble too. The Dutch had learned the process during their occupation of the Northeast and had carried it to the Caribbean, and the price was falling. And then, in the mountains behind the coast, a group of frontier prospectors from Sao Paulo found something in a streambed. It is the 1690s, in the hills of a place that will be named for what is in it. Minas Gerais, the General Mines. The gold is alluvial. It is not locked in hard rock, requiring engineering and deep shafts. It is sitting in river gravel, recoverable with a pan, a sluice, and an enormous amount of labor. What follows is the first great gold rush of the modern world, and for sheer volume, nothing before it comes close. Across the 18th century, roughly 1,200 tons of gold were taken out of the Brazilian interior, from Minas Gerais and later Goiás, Bahia, and Mato Grosso. Officially, around 800 tons of it were shipped to Portugal. The real figure was higher because smuggling was constant and the records themselves were not safe. A fire at the Lisbon Customs House in 1764 destroyed a great deal of the accounting. At its height, the Americas were producing something like 85% of the world's gold, and Minas Gerais was the center of it. The Crown's instrument was a tax called the Quinto Real, the Royal Fifth. 20% of everything mined, collected at mints established at Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, and Villa Rica. Over the century, the Crown took in the order of 130 tons of gold that way. Around 400,000 prospectors and settlers went into the mining districts, and around 500,000 enslaved Africans were taken there to do the digging.
in river gravel, in water, under conditions that killed at a rate the mine owners simply budgeted for. The wealth of the Baroque churches of Minas Gerais, the gilt, the carved cedar, the work of Alexandria, was paid for out of that. Vila Rica, later called Ouro Preto, held around 40,000 people by 1730 and more than 80,000 not long after. In 1750, it had more inhabitants than New York. A mining town in the mountains of the Brazilian interior was larger than the principal port of British North America. And in Lisbon, the effect was immediate and visible. The domestic gold stock rose from just over 1 billion reis in 1720, a little over 1% of national output, to more than 58 billion by the middle of the century. More than half of everything the country produced. Ships arrived on the Tagus with gold in the hold. King John V built a palace monastery at Mafra that took 13 years and tens of thousands of workers. The court became one of the most extravagant in Europe. And this is the moment. This is the peak of everything in this story. More gold moving faster into a smaller country than at any point in the history of money to that date. Now watch where it goes. In 1703, Portugal and England had signed a treaty. It is remembered as the Treaty of Cloths and Wines, and it is 2 paragraphs long. Portugal would admit English woolen cloth at low duty. England would admit Portuguese wine at a rate 1/3 lower than French wine. On paper, that is an unremarkable trade agreement. In practice, it decided what Portugal would be for the next 200 years. Because Portugal had no textile industry to protect, and now had no reason to build one. English cloth was cheap, plentiful, and permanently available. Portuguese workshops could not compete and did not try. The country's manufacturing was not destroyed so much as never allowed to begin. And Portugal, buying far more from England than it could ever pay for in wine, settled the difference in the only currency it had in unlimited supply: gold. The metal was landed at Lisbon, and within the same season, a very large share of it was on packet boats to London. British merchants operating in Lisbon shipped it out by the chest, quite openly, because the trade balance demanded it. It went into British banks. It went into British coin. It underwrote the credit that financed British industry at precisely the moment that industry was beginning. Portugal dug the largest quantity of gold ever taken out of the ground and used it to buy shirts. There is the answer to the question in the cold open, and it is not a mystery. The money went to London. It went there legally, contractually, and by a mechanism the Portuguese crown had signed itself. A Portuguese official in Brazil had seen it coming in 1701, before the rush had even properly begun. He wrote that so much gold might mean trading it away for the things they needed, so that the countries they traded with would have all the profit and Portugal would have all the work. He was describing his own century, 20 years early. And the gold thinned. Alluvial deposits are finite in a way that reefs are not. You cannot dig deeper into a riverbed. Yields fell from the 1760s. Whole districts emptied. Ouro Preto stayed on its mountain, its churches gold-leafed, its streets steep and cobbled, and the population drained away down the road it had come up. Brazil declared independence in 1822, and Portugal, which had spent 3 centuries as the pipeline for other people's produce, was left holding the pipe. There is one more thing the Treaty of 1703 did, and it is the part of this story you can still drink.
The Douro Valley runs east from Porto into the mountains, a gorge of schist and slate so steep that the vineyards have to be cut into it as terraces, wall after wall of stacked stone, some of them built 400 years ago and standing yet. It is a bad place to farm anything. The soil is thin, the summers are extreme, and it happens to be one of the finest places on earth to grow wine grapes, precisely because vines do their best work when they are made to struggle. English merchants had bought Portuguese wine for centuries. After 1703, with French wine taxed higher, they bought a great deal more of it. Over 70% of Portugal's wine output went to England. Fortified with brandy so it would survive the voyage, it acquired the name of the city it shipped from. In 1756, the Crown drew a boundary around the valley, defined what could be planted inside it, and regulated the quality of what came out. It was the first demarcated wine region in Europe, a piece of economic law 250 years ahead of its time. And it is worth sitting with what that actually is. The most famous product Portugal makes, the thing on the shelf in every country in the world with the country's name on it, exists in its present form because of a treaty that traded a manufacturing future for a market in cloth. Port is not a symbol of the empire, it is the receipt. Which brings us to the man who saw the whole arrangement clearly, and to the morning that gave him the authority to do something about it. The 1st of November 1755, a little after 9:30 in the morning. It is a holy day, and the churches of Lisbon are full. An earthquake begins offshore. It runs for several minutes, and it brings down most of a capital city. Fire follows. Then a wave comes up the Tagus and takes the waterfront. Out of a population of 275,000, tens of thousands died. The Casa da India went into the river with its records. Palaces, libraries, the accumulated documentation of 2.5 centuries of trade. And here is where the story usually ends, in the version people carry around. Portugal was a great power. Then there was an earthquake. Then it was not a great power. That version is comforting, and it is wrong. And it is worth saying why. The Estado da India had lost its doors more than a century before the earthquake. The pepper monopoly had been failing since the 1590s. The treaty that sent the gold to London was 52 years old that morning. Everything structural about the decline of Portuguese wealth was already in place, in writing, and largely irreversible before a single stone moved. The earthquake did not cause the fall. It removed the last of the scenery in front of it. The man who cleared the rubble understood that better than anyone. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later the Marquess of Pombal, was the king's chief minister, and for the next 22 years, he tried to build the thing Portugal had never got around to building. He rebuilt central Lisbon on a grid, in identical blocks, on timber frames designed to flex, some of the first deliberately earthquake-resistant buildings in Europe. He chartered monopoly trading companies to take business back from foreign merchants. He subsidised textile works and glass works and iron works. He reformed the treasury and the tax collection. He demarcated the Douro. He broke the power of the old aristocratic houses and expelled the Jesuits. He was trying, 250 years late and with the gold receipts already falling, to convert a corridor into a country. Some of it held, much of it did not, because a manufacturing base is not a decree. It is workshops and skills and customers accumulated across generations. And Portugal had spent those generations counting other people's cargo. When the king died in 1777, the new queen dismissed Pombal and confined him to the town he took his title from. He died there 4 years later. The grid he laid out is still the centre of Lisbon. People walk through it every day without knowing that it was the country's last serious attempt to change what it lived on.
The rest is quieter. Napoleon's armies came, and the royal family sailed for Brazil, and when they came back, the empire's centre of gravity did not come with them. Brazil went in 1822. The African colonies were held, at increasing cost and with increasing violence, until a revolution at home let them go in the mid-70s. Macau was handed to China in 1999, closing a ledger that had been opened in 1557. And through the whole of the 20th century, the country exported the one thing it still had a surplus of: people. Annual departures rose from around 22,000 in 1950 to 183,000 by 1970. In the 1960s alone, more than 1 million Portuguese left, for France, for Germany, for Switzerland, for Brazil, for the United States. At the peak, the money they sent home was worth somewhere between 5 and 10% of everything the country produced. A nation that had once financed itself by taxing other people's voyages was now financing itself on the wages of its own children, working somewhere else. Today, Portugal is a member of the European Union and, by most measures, a comfortable and successful country. 10.5 million people. Life expectancy among the highest in the world. Its wine, its footwear, its car parts, its software, its tourism. And more than half of the world's cork comes out of its oak woodlands, which is worth a moment, because of all the industries in this story, it is the only one that cannot be hurried. A cork oak is stripped by hand. The outer bark is cut away from the trunk without wounding the tree, and then the tree is left alone for 9 years while it grows the bark back. 9 years. A tree cannot be usefully stripped until it is around 25 years old, and the first 2 harvests are too coarse for bottle stoppers. The first cork worth selling comes off a tree in its 40s. The men working the groves in the Alentejo today are cutting bark from trees planted by people they never met, for a harvest their grandchildren will take. It is the exact opposite of a gold rush, and it has outlasted every fortune in this documentary. And its income per person is still below the European average and among the lowest in Western Europe. Its young people still leave, around 75,000 a year across the last 2 decades, with the highest qualifications of any generation the country has produced. The corridor is still a corridor, only now the traffic is people. Go to Belém on a clear morning and the monastery is exactly where it was in 1501. The stone is that pale gold limestone they quarried up the hill at Ajuda. The cloister is carved with rope and coral and armillary spheres. There is a queue. There is always a queue. Several thousand people a day, holding tickets, waiting to walk through a building that a tax on pepper paid for. And that is the strange, quiet joke at the end of 500 years. The pepper money is gone. It has been gone for 4 centuries. And it did not go missing. It went to Antwerp, and then to Amsterdam, and then to London, exactly as the contracts said it would. The gold is gone the same way, into vaults in another country, where it did its work and stayed. What Portugal kept was the building. And the building, 500 years on, is now generating an income of its own, from visitors who have come to look at what the money bought. It turns out that is not nothing. It is just not what anybody was aiming for. Perhaps the thing to understand about the first global empire is that it was never really an empire in the way the word suggests. There was no great territory. Portugal, at its height, administered a few dozen fortified points on the edges of continents it never entered, held by a few thousand men, connected by a handful of ships crossing an enormous amount of water. What it had was position. It got to the doors first, and for about 100 years, it charged everybody else for the use of them. And a toll is a wonderful business, right up until the moment somebody builds a road around you, or arrives with a bigger gun, or simply signs a treaty that makes it cheaper to buy their cloth than to make your own. Money that passes through your hands is not the same as money that stays in them. It looks identical while it is moving. That is the whole difficulty. The ships were real, the cargo was real, the gold was real, and the century in which Lisbon was the richest waterfront in Europe was entirely real. It simply was not, in the end, Portugal's. Perhaps what matters is not how much passed through the Tagus, but what a country chooses to build while it still has the chance. Thank you for watching.